We've seen over the last few studies that God is eternal. He doesn't age. He doesn't improve. He doesn't decline. He remains constant. And that is a key facet of being eternal. But we're also going to see that another facet of that eternality is what theologically we call immutability, but it really is simply what we were just saying about his eternality. He personally doesn't change. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we are answering the question, who is God? And we've been talking about God's eternality. We're going to turn our attention to now this idea that God is immutable. Now, when we're talking about immutability or that God doesn't change, we're talking about he doesn't change in terms of who he is. Now, there are things that God does, and we will look at that down the road, but there are things that God does or that he may change, but he himself does not change. He doesn't go from a God that is good to a God that is bad. He doesn't go from a God that is all-powerful to a God who is weak. He doesn't go from a God that knows all things to a God that has forgotten. This is not the character of God. So this is what we're talking about with immutability. As an example, just real quickly, immutability does not mean, and there are people that argue this, that because God doesn't change when he gave the law, then the law always has to be enforced and the law can never be removed. And yet we have plenty of scriptures in the New Testament that say that Christ has ended the law and he's finished the law and he's completed the law and that the law is no longer in effect for us. And people say, well, that can't be because God would then change. No, he's changing what he does, but his person doesn't change. His nature doesn't change. And that's what we're talking about, that God in his nature doesn't change. So if we go to Psalm 102, verse 25, it says, of old you founded the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. And even they will perish, but you endure, you stand. We've already looked at this with his eternality. All of them will wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them. He's going to create new heavens and new earth, and they will be changed. But you are the same, or you are he. In other words, you're always what you are. So they translate you are the same. Literally, you are he, and your years will not come to an end. They will not culminate at any point in time. So we're going to go over to this, one of these key texts in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6. And this is in the context where God is, this is his last spoken word to the people of Israel before there's going to be essentially about 400 years of silence until he begins to speak through some other people around the time of the birth of Christ. And in Malachi 3:6, it says, for I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. As he's speaking these last words to Israel, he's going through all the problems they have, all the things that they're not doing right, all the things that the law dictated that they are not abiding by, the way that they're treating each other, the favoritism that they're showing to certain people and then denigrating others. All of this to say that he says that he's indicating that they're unrighteous left and right. Yet, because I, the Lord, do not change, therefore you, O sons of Jacob, are not consumed. Now, what does he mean, I don't change? Well, in his person, in his nature, he doesn't change. And therefore, part of that, we just a little bit ago finished looking at the fact that God is true or truth, and that God is therefore faithful. If you go to Malachi 1:2, it says, I have loved you, says the Lord. But you say, well, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob, but I've hated Esau, and I've made his mountains a desolation, appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. And so he says, I've loved you. I set my love upon you, and I'm continuing to set my love upon you. That hasn't changed because I've made that promise. We could go back to his promise back over in the book of Genesis where he talks to Abraham in Genesis 12, and he says, I'm choosing you, and I'm choosing your descendants to be the people that I'm going to bless, the people through whom I'm going to work for Well, Abraham didn't know this, but for the next 1,500 years, he was going to work through the people of Israel. Actually, at that point, 2,000 years from the time that he first spoke to Abraham. And so God made this promise to Abraham. Now, if God could change, then God could break that promise. But he didn't make that promise to Abraham and says, well, I will do this for you, Abraham, if you promise to be a good guy and a great guy and do all the things I ask. And we pointed that out before, that if you read the story of Abraham, you sometimes would be really hard pressed to see a real man of faith. You'd see a man that had some real doubts and had some character flaws. That's putting it lightly, I would say. He was human, and he wasn't necessarily outstanding in everything that he did. And yet, he did believe God's promise, and he did act on God's promise on at least 2 occasions. And he, therefore, was one that received the promise from God, and God maintained that promise. And he didn't give that promise to him and maintain it because Abraham was faithful. He did it because God is faithful, because God is true. And therefore, we could come back to this, he says, I, the Lord, do not change. In other words, he'd made this promise, and he had set his love upon them. In fact, he said this when he had sent Moses to the people of Israel. He says, this isn't because of you. He says, I'm doing this because of the promise that I made to the fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. It was a promise that he'd made way back then, that he was keeping that promise all the way up to the time that he sent Moses. When he says, I do not change, this word change means to alter something about, and just some very quick passages to illustrate this. This is his promise to David. If we went back up in the context, he's talking about the people of Israel. He says, but I will not break off my loving kindness from him, nor deal falsely in my faithfulness, here with regard to Israel, My covenant I will not violate, nor will I alter, and that word alter is the word change the utterance of my lips. Once I've sworn by my holiness, and I will not lie to David. It was David, okay. I couldn't remember. I was pretty sure it was David. I just need to look down here in this verse. So it's a promise that he made to David. And even though you look at some of David's descendants down the road, you see that God remained faithful and continued that line, despite the fact that some of those guys really went off the rails, worshipped other gods and everything. But he says, I'm not going to change the utterances of my lips. In 2 Kings chapter 25, Jehoiachin, this was one of the kings, one of the descendants of David, changed his prison clothes and had meals in the king's presence. He's been hauled off to Babylon. He's in prison, but now he changes his clothes. We get that idea of changing your clothes. You know, you're wearing grubby clothes that you work outside in, and then you're going to go in and you're going to do something nice, sit down at a nice table, you get cleaned up, and you put on nice clothes. Well, that's what he did. He changed his clothes. Just like here, God didn't alter or didn't change what he promised to David. He made that promise, and he was standing by it. 1 Kings 14:1, and at that time Abijah the son of Jeroboam became sick, and Jeroboam said to his wife, arise now and disguise yourself so that they will not know that you are the wife of Jeroboam, and go to Shiloh. And that word disguise is that same word that we had over in Malachi 3:6, change yourself. In other words, alter your appearance in some way. And we got some other illustrations we could look at this, but it has the idea that you're changing something about yourself. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're changing what you do. Now, in this case, maybe she was changing something about what she did, but when we are looking at Malachi chapter 3, God himself doesn't change, so he stands by the promise that he made to Abraham. And this is important. It really is related to the fact that God is truth and that God is faithful, but it also relates to the fact that God is eternal. And all those things, we understand that in God's nature, then, God is a God that doesn't change. Like we said, he doesn't go from a loving God to a non-loving God, a vicious, hateful God. He doesn't go from a God who is all-powerful to a God that's weak. He remains constant in his character, though he may, and we will look at some examples, he may change what he does as long as it's consistent with his nature. This is what we call the immutability of God. And there's certainly more things to say about this, which we'll look at in the upcoming days, but I want to encourage you to worship God for the fact that he in his nature doesn't change, that unlike us, and we were talking about this with his eternality, that you and I change, and we've got things that we used to do, and we're like, I remember when I used to do this, and can't really do that anymore. And you're like, oh, man. But God remains solid, doesn't change in those things. We can really appreciate that, his immutability, or if you just want to use a simple term, God doesn't change in his nature. Worship him for that fact. And with that, I encourage you to have a good day in the Lord, and I want to thank you for joining me.